I love how the story of Jesus unfolds in the Gospel of Mark. Mark definitely wanted to write in such a way that we could easily see in our minds the unfolding story of the life of Jesus. And I would encourage you as you read through it, not just to read through it, but really imagine what it must have been like to have been there with Jesus. Imagine what it would have been like to be an eyewitness of these events and to participate in the life with Jesus, to be able to hear him teach and to be able to walk beside him. I also remind you in this gospel, best we can tell, Mark was not a disciple. He was a disciple. He wasn't an apostle. He wasn't one of the 12. But he got the information about the gospel from Peter. And Peter very much was right there. And I can imagine in my mind Peter telling the story to Mark of this is what happened one day with Jesus, and the Holy Spirit inspiring Mark as he wrote the story. Today we pick up in Mark chapter 1, in verse 35. It says, "And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus departed, and he went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed." One of the interesting things is found throughout the Gospel of Mark, and reality is found in several of the Gospels, and has some references in the Old Testament, is the importance of that desolate place. It's a place of quiet. It's a place of being able to stop. And we're reminded that Jesus, early in the morning, before the day began, that he went away to pray. He desired that communion with his Father. He desired to be reminded of God's love. Though he knew all those things, there was that importance of pulling away. And I just remind you that it's so important in our lives that we take time to follow the example of Jesus. And we talk about following the example of Jesus. Part of that example is pulling away, just stopping and going to that desolate place where you can just hear the voice of God. And sometimes I'm so afraid we're so busy doing things that we're not listening when God's speaking. And I also just encourage you, I know not everybody's a morning person, but I encourage you, start your day in prayer. Start your day separated with God so that you have your priorities and the day in order for the day. So Jesus goes away. His priorities, by the way, his priorities are established because he made time for that which was most important. You and I talk about the importance of our relationship with Jesus Christ. Well, let's demonstrate it by finding that time. It's interesting that while he was gone, Simon Peter came to him, and here's what he said. Verse 36, it's described this way. "And Simon Peter and those who were with him, they searched for him, and they found him, and they said, 'Jesus, everyone is looking for you.' And Jesus then said to them, 'So let's go away to the next town, that I may preach there also, for that is why I've come.'" It's interesting because the disciples come and they find Jesus in this desolate place, and we don't know, perhaps they thought that the being separated was perhaps a waste of time. It wasn't the most important thing. And then they find Jesus and they say, "Jesus, look, there's people. There's people who need you. There's people who are expecting to hear from you." Jesus, on the other hand, looks back at them and says, "Let's go to the next town. There are those who need to hear Christ. Let's go over there and let me preach and teach there." One of the truths that you see within this is just a reminder that Jesus was not controlled by popular demand, but instead he was controlled by priorities within his heart of doing what God's called him to do. And you and I will always be called again in so many different directions. And the reality is we need to make sure that we're not just doing what people think we should be doing, but we're doing what God's called us to do. And even though good-meaning people, like the disciples, will come and they said to Jesus, "Jesus, come, people are looking for you." And Jesus says, "Let's go to a different place." Even though good-meaning people will come and will speak into your hearts and say things like, "This is what you need to do," ultimately you need to decide what God's calling you to do, and you need to be obedient to follow after him. And so the disciples say, "Come do this," and Jesus says, "We're heading some other place." He says, "That's why I've come. I've come not to be the popular person, to do what others have called me to do. I've come to do the will of my Father, which is to preach the gospel." And in verse 39 is this summation which says, "And then he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. He went from place to place. It's interesting. He goes to synagogue. It's the place of worship and study for Jewish believers. They were people who were anticipating the Messiah. They had a certain sense of a basic understanding that Jesus was coming, though they didn't recognize Jesus. So since they were anticipating the Messiah, Jesus would go and meet them where they were and open the Scriptures. It says that he preached, but he also cast out demons. He had that authority that can only come from God. In verse 40, the story continues to unfold, and it says, then a leper. Leper in these days was one who had this skin disease, and oftentimes it was many different types of skin diseases, and the way they oftentimes would treat a person with leprosy was simply to ostracize them. They had to live outside the city, and if anyone came near them, they had to scream at the top of their lungs, unclean. If you were a leper found in a crowd because they were afraid of it being contagious, you placed yourself in a position where you could be stoned. This leper, obviously, this man that had this skin disease was obviously one who was in a great need because he risked much by coming to Jesus. But once again, what he discovered is that there is hope in Jesus. He understood that in the midst of a crisis, his own personal crisis, the thing he needed to do was to go to Jesus. So he comes to Jesus, and I love the unfolding of the story of the man that came to Jesus as described in Mark chapter 1, beginning in verse 40. So this leper came to him, and he was imploring him. This is a word which implies he was asking, and he was asking, and he was asking. This was something he really believed in, and so he wanted to ask Jesus. You can tell when a child really wants something because oftentimes they'll come and they'll ask, and they'll ask, and they'll ask. This man came, and he was just imploring Jesus. By the way, out of a great deal of both reverence and respect, he knelt down in front of Jesus and listened to his words. He says, Jesus, if you will, you can make me clean. Wow, what a statement. He didn't say, if you can. He's not doubting Jesus's ability. That's the reason he's come to him. He says, Jesus, I know you can do this. That's the reason the leper has risked everything to come and find Jesus. What he says is, if you will. The leper was simply in a place where he was submitting himself to God's plan. And he's saying, Jesus, if this is in your plan, if this is something that you're willing to do, I place myself before you. I think so often we come to God and we expect from him that he will act. One of the things we should never do is question his ability. We do that, but God is able. What we do, though, is that because he's God and we're not, because he understands more than we could ever understand, we come to God and here's what we say, God, if you will, your will. Even Jesus prayed this in the garden. Your will be done. And so he says, if you will. Now listen to what happens next. So moved with pity. Any person that's ever heard me teach, I love this word. The word for pity is compassion. It's the word splachna in the Greek. It means the twisting or turning. Jesus saw a need and he didn't just go, oh, there's a need, but it moved him. Jesus is impacted. He's moved by the needs of people. I want to remind you that one of the things we need to make sure we do is, as children of God, that we are individuals who are moved by the needs of people around us. Jesus was moved with compassion. He saw the need and it changed him. It had an impact upon him. And it says that he was moved with compassion. And listen what happens. He stretched out his hand and he touched him. You got to remember, it probably had been perhaps years since this man had been touched because he had leprosy. But the ostracization that took place in his life was not an obstacle for Jesus. Jesus reaches out of compassion and he touches him. And then he says to him, I will be clean. And immediately, there's Mark's favorite word, immediately it happens. Jesus spoke and the leprosy left him and he was made clean. It's quite a reminder. Both these passages together, the first passage we saw, Jesus goes out to a desolate place to pray. The importance of finding that time with God and showing God that we really believe he is a priority. But as we go to God, we go to Him with the understanding that He's able, but we submit ourselves to His will because He does know best. I'll just be honest with you. I don't know why some things happen. If it was my decision, things would be different. But I'm thankful I'm not God, and I'm thankful that God is so much bigger than I am. His mind, His ability, His knowledge is greater than mine. And so He is the one to whom we submit, and we say, if you will, Jesus. And the leprosy was cleansed. Now listen to what happens. To me, this is a sad note to end on. Jesus then charged the man, and He sent him away at once. And here's what He said to him. See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for proof to them. This man had been ostracized for as long as he had been diagnosed with leprosy. And a part of the process of being reintroduced back into society is that if a person was cleansed, they'd go to the temple and the priest would proclaim them cleansed. And then they offered a thanksgiving offering to God. That's what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, don't go spread this everywhere. Give God glory. Don't let everybody know. Don't say, hey, Jesus healed me. Jesus did heal him, but Jesus had a greater purpose, a different purpose than being just one who healed. He was here to preach the kingdom. He was here to eventually die upon the cross. And Jesus said, don't go talking about me. Instead, give glory to God. Give Him the honor. Go and make your way back into the temple and to worship. But listen to what happens. But the man went out and he began to talk freely about it. And he spread the news so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in those desolate places. And people were coming to Him out to the desolate places from everywhere. So in this story, during this Bible study, I'm just reminded that here's a man who had leprosy, who had no hope, and he's healed. And his first act, his first response to God's work in his life was disobedience. He did the very thing that God asked him not to do. Jesus said, don't go tell everyone, just go to the temple and glorify God. Give thanks to God, offer the sacrifice, and be proclaimed free, cleansed. And instead he went out and told everybody. And Jesus then was not able to go about in the city because of this man's disobedience. How do we respond to God's work in our lives? May it never be said of us, may it never be said that our first response to God's intervention in our lives is disobedience. Let's be faithful. So go to the desolate place. Find time with God. Show God that without any question, He is our priority. Understand the necessity of getting your direction, your sustenance from Him. Know that God is able when you come to Him. Submit yourself to His will and then be obedient as a sign of your thankfulness. May God bless you as you walk on the way with Jesus.